Good morning, my name is Soni Werner, and I'm going to talk to you today about the human conscience. And I am fascinated with this area, and so I decided to write a book about it, and I use it now in my classes at Bernathen College. So currently I am teaching a class with 20 eager psychology majors, and every day we talk about forensic psychology. In other words, the criminal mind. What's unique about this class is that we talk about it from the point of view of both physical psychology, as well as social psychology, as well as spiritual psychology. So I'm going to be trying to summarize the book a little, and then if you're interested, you can always download the book. The book comes in the form of an ebook, so people can download it onto their iPad or their phone. And you'll hear information about that here, as well as I have things out in the lobby. So why do I study the dark side of humanity? Before I came to Bernathen College, one of my careers was to work in a maximum security prison. So I worked for 5 years with people who had done some of the most horrendous crimes, murder, rape, all kinds of terrorism. And they were in a New York State prison that happened to have a college inside the prison, and I was the professor there. So I taught psychology, and I learned a great deal about their thoughts, their feelings, whether or not they had any remorse. And so ever since then, I've been fascinated with this area of psychology. I also currently am getting ready to retire. And in my retirement, I've already started some of my volunteer activities. One of them is that I'm going to be working with women who are coming out of prison, people who are ex-cons, if you want to call them that, and they're trying to re-enter society. So I'm going to be a mentor to them. I also work with a lot of people who have addiction in their families and trying to help both the children of addicts as well as people who are addicts themselves. So even though I'm not a neuroscientist, I love to actually read about the brain. So I'm fascinated with what neuroscientists have to say about the very specific structures and functions of the brain, and also what happens when those parts of the brain no longer work. So I'll be telling you a little bit about that physiological perspective. In general, I'm an optimist, and I buy into the concept from psychology as well as Swedenborgian psychology, which is that I assume that it's our job as psychologists to describe things very carefully, especially about the human mind, to try to explain why people do what they do, such as crime, and also to try to predict who might become a criminal or who might repeat their crimes. In addition, many psychologists are responsible for trying to change human behavior. And so we'll talk a little bit about, can people rehabilitate? Big question. In general, if people want to get help, they are more likely to change their ways. The question is, do we try to intervene early, like when they're children, or adolescents when they've started to break the law, or maybe even as elders who have been doing crime for decades? It's a fascinating question that we'll explore. I think in general, I'm very fascinated with the quote from the Old Testament that talks about we should love mercy, we should do justice, and we should be humble when we're doing our work. And this has really become a guiding principle for me. It's very important that I don't try to act like I'm better than other people. The Lord is taking care of all of us. So part of my spiritual goal is to understand people and to try to apply mercy when I can, but also be aware that there are civil and moral judgments that have to happen. But the Lord is in charge of spiritual judgments. So how did I organize my ebook? I decided to organize it in terms of 3 big chunks. The first has to do with preventing crime. So we talk about things like, well, what are the first signs that a child might be in trouble and might become a criminal later on? And we're now able to do longitudinal research that looks at very specific behaviors. For instance, if a child shows that they're kind of callous, meaning that they don't show a lot of empathy when other people are in trouble, especially if they've harmed another child. If they don't show that they're at all remorseful if they caused it, and they don't have a lot of concern if somebody is bleeding. That's a very serious sign that we have to watch out for. Another one is that if they seem to laugh after people are hurt. Another is if they hurt little children younger than themselves, or they hurt animals. They are destructive to property. So we have psychologists, particularly people working with children who have emotional challenges, try to catch them early and see if we can redirect them. Another chapter is called intervention, and this is primarily focused on adolescents and young adults whose brains are not fully formed yet. It's not until we're maybe age 25 that our brain is really quite mature, And so when they do crimes before that, there's still hope that maybe they can be redirected. Some of the research that I've been fascinated with are things like teaching teenagers how to mediate conflicts with their peers. A lot of them have no skill of conflict resolution. They don't know how to problem solve. And so maybe nobody taught them, or they never had good role models for how to solve problems by understanding different people's perspectives. So there are many people, for instance, down in the city of Baltimore, which is unfortunately notorious for having a lot of gang violence. There actually are ceasefire outreach workers who are going in there and doing some of the mediation between gang members and then teaching the gang members how to mediate. And they're making some success in terms of reducing the number of crimes. So I'm fascinated with that. I'm also really interested in rehabilitation. And again, I worked in a large prison, and so that was not only trying to, quote, punish people for 25 years to life, but also see if we could rehabilitate them. So I have some experience in that area. But it's a complicated area, especially, for instance, if the people have been addicted to certain substances. For instance, we don't have a lot of success helping people recover from a cocaine addiction. Looking at worldwide, the research indicates that that is one of the most highly addictive substances. It's very, very difficult for people to get off of that. And they want the substance so badly that it's very hard for them to even think about rehabilitation, because all they want is more of the cocaine. But you have a different pattern with people who are addicted to alcohol, marijuana, and others. Within each of my 3 chapters of prevention, intervention, and rehabilitation, I also take 3 different levels of fascination that I focus my students on. One is the physiological, and I'm going to give you a short course in the brain in a minute. Another is the social. What do we actually do with people that we are talking face to face? What can we actually do to intervene? I'm also interested in bringing in a Swedenborgian perspective. So this is what the ebook looks like, and there's information here that you can click on, or out in the hallway I have a handout that shows you how you can download it for just $2.99. So what's a spiritual view? Most judges and juries and forensic psychologists don't really spend much time publicly talking about a spiritual perspective, and I've chosen to do that. It doesn't mean that I'm trying to necessarily tell people they have to join my church, but I am interested in bringing in a unique spiritual Swedenborgian view. So here are a few of the ideas that I've drawn from the Swedenborg's writings that I find fascinating. One of the key things is that after death, Swedenborg tells us in the book Heaven and Hell, there is no hypocrisy. And that's a big issue, because when I've dealt with criminals, there's very often, they're trying to con me, they're trying to put on a front, they're trying to pretend they never did any crimes. And it's all hypocrisy. And the Lord gives us permission to do that while we're on this earth. But in the afterlife, all those masks are gone. What matters is your motives, and did you love to do what you did on this earth? And so they give you a life review, and they give you a chance to kind of look over everything you did and every human being you ever affected, positively or negatively. And if that really happens, that's quite interesting. So that puts the civil government on this earth in perspective to what's going to happen after life. And what matters is if somebody is sincere, if they regret what they did. Maybe they didn't understand what they did. Maybe they were mentally challenged. Maybe they were under the influence of drugs. Maybe they had a brain injury from a traumatic accident. But in the next world, you're restored your rational mind, and you get a chance to really decide, did you love doing those crimes, or do you have remorse, or you didn't understand what the rules were? And I like to pretend that if they are remorseful and they really care about humanity, then they get to go learn how to be a productive member of society. And that's where the true rehabilitation can happen. So I like to keep that in the back of my mind as I'm looking at both civil and moral levels as well. I also like to believe the concept that no matter who a person is, there's a little place inside of their mind that is their soul, and nobody can ruin it, not even themselves. Nobody can ruin that. So everybody still has the potential once they get to the afterlife. And that is not always the case in some people's perspective. A lot of people think they're the evil, they're the devil, they're monsters, they're less than human. I try not to take that stance. I assume that the Lord is protecting this little soul inside of you that means that you still have a chance when you get to the next world. But it all depends on how much did you love to do what you did, or did you regret it, and then what are you going to do after that? Okay, back to the idea of the conscience and forensic psychology. And my focus initially was on prevention. And I'm very interested in what can we do. So one of the ideas that I've drawn from both spiritual doctrine as well as from psychology and neuroscience is that I've come to the conclusion at this point that it's really important to guide children by looking at them face to face. So if a child is naughty, it's a very good idea for the grown-ups involved, parents or teachers, to get down at their level and look right into their eyes, not screaming at them, but to say, no, we don't hit our brother. No, you're not allowed to steal that toy. And that really has an effect on children. It doesn't have to be for long, but it needs to be frequently enough so that children start to read your face and they can actually remember that. It seems to be that that is a powerful way to try to prevent. Much better than screaming at children or empty threats or just letting them do whatever they want. So I have a whole different section just on that. As I mentioned, I'm very interested in the whole area of rehabilitation. And having worked in a prison that used a program, for instance, called Scared Straight. And Scared Straight is a program that tries to bring in first-time offenders, juveniles who have broken the law. And then they match them up with criminals who have been doing this for a long time and they're in prison. And psychologists have tried to have these people scare these people to make them good. It doesn't work. We tried, it doesn't work. And so just making somebody afraid for the moment might make you afraid, but it doesn't really build a conscience. So we're still looking for ways to build a conscience. Then I got very interested in borrowing from another field, and that's the field of medicine. I'm not a medical doctor, but I'm fascinated reading about stem cells. Now, at first, stem cells were a controversy because we could only get these little teeny, immature, microscopic cells from a little baby fetus. And now you can get them from your own long bone marrow, in your hip or in your arm. Amazing. So doctors are now able to pull those out, transplant them into your brain. We've actually had success helping people recover from strokes. So here's my guess. This is a prediction. We don't have research for it yet. My prediction is that we might be able to transplant stem cells into the parts of the brain that are your conscience. We'll talk about the brain in a minute. And I'm fascinated. If a person's brain is damaged, particularly their frontal lobe, they're not going to make very good decisions. So could we put those stem cells? Big question. I hope we can find that one out. I also had legal questions because I'm not a lawyer. So I had to try to figure out what are they talking about when they take a person into custody and when they have to decide whether or not the person is responsible for what they did. If we have the evidence, let's say we have a whole crime on video or we have a whole bunch of people who say it happened, then there's no debate about whether or not the person did it. But then what's going on in their mind? So some of you may have heard some of these terms, such as NGRI or GBMI. First I thought, what is that? Well, the first one is called not guilty by reason of insanity. Another one is guilty, but mentally ill. So what's the difference between those two? So I spent a lot of time trying to understand those two, and I'm going to give you some examples of recent famous cases, and we'll talk about those. Another term that I learned about when I tried to understand the legal perspective is the word competent. What does it mean for the judge and the lawyers to look at a person who has committed a crime and decide whether or not they're competent to stand trial? And so what I'm learning is it has to do with, are they mentally stable enough that they will understand that they're in a court of law and that there are consequences if they're found guilty. They have to at least understand what a lawyer is, and they can't be completely disconnected in a delusional world. They have to be competent. So who figures that out? Forensic psychologists do. That's not an easy job to do, because maybe the criminal is still recovering from a drug addiction. Maybe they've been injured and their brain doesn't work so well. Maybe they are mentally challenged. Maybe they just really have amnesia. So these kind of problems become fascinating. And so I started really trying to understand what those are. Let's take some cases. Raise your hand if you know about this case. This has happened in Colorado. And this is a case where a young man who actually was a psychology major, he actually studied the brain for a while, and then he started having some mental illness issues. We're not exactly sure when, but probably in his early 20s. And it was easy to catch him after he did his crime. What he did is he chose to go to a movie theater in the middle of the night during one of the midnight showings so that there would be fewer children. So that tells you some intent. He didn't want to hurt children, but he didn't care who else he hurt. And he came in a side door, sort of like that one, and he had a costume on, Batman theme, and he started to shoot people. And he killed a lot of people and he injured a lot of people. He didn't have a particular person in mind. He just started killing. It was awful. Now, he was able to be caught within a day. So he almost stood around waiting to see what would happen. Apparently, a day or two before that, he sent some papers, maybe some kind of a journal, to his mental health professional. But it didn't reach in time. But if that mental health professional had gotten it, it might have given a clue that he was about to do something terrible. So that raises another question. Should we intervene if we think someone's about to do something terrible? But that didn't happen. So anyway, the question became, if we already have the evidence that he killed all these people and hurt many others, is he guilty? Is he insane? Is he competent to stand trial? Is he malingering? That's a term lawyers use that means, is he lying? Is he making things up about why he did things or why he didn't do things? And culpable is, again, a legal term that means, are you responsible for what you did? Another term that they use is, I think, a Latin term called mens rea, which means the psychologists have to figure out what was going on in the mind of the criminal at the time of the crime. Well, you may know a little bit about this interesting case. One fascinating feature is that the people, when they were going to have a trial, they decided they would have a trial because they had to really discuss the question about whether or not he was mentally ill at the time that he did this terrible thing. It was the biggest search in history to try to find people to be on the jury. They had to call 9,000 people before they could get a dozen who would be unbiased enough to be able to be on the jury. That is the biggest search we've ever had in history because people were just like, oh, I couldn't possibly be on that jury. So people kept saying, no, not me, not me. Fascinating. Anyway, so they found him guilty, but his parents kept going publicly saying he is not guilty because he's insane. And then the lawyers tried to decide, is that the case? Should we hold him responsible? And eventually what happens is that forensic psychologists evaluate criminals and give advice or expert testimony to the court. And that goes to the judge and jury. And they are the ones who decide. Forensic psychologists don't judge. They evaluate and assess people's mental state, but they give their witness testimony. What happened in this case is that they did find him guilty, but the jury was split about whether or not he was mentally stable at the time that he killed all those people. So they decided not to give him the death penalty. He is now in jail. Let's take another case. Maybe you know this one. If you know about the woman named Gabby Gifford, she was a congresswoman who was shot by this man, Jared Launer, I think you say, Jared Launer. And in this case, he seemed to premeditate in that we have evidence that he planned this. He hated the government, and he ranted against women being in positions of government. So he targeted her and anybody who was around her. So as opposed to the previous example, this one had a person in mind and was going to go kill her. And we have evidence of that. In the process, he went to a mall in Arizona and he killed at least 6 people, and many others were hurt. Again, the question comes up. Was he insane? Was he guilty? Was he culpable? And so what's interesting about this particular case that forensic psychologists come in on is that they were able to catch him pretty quickly because he was right there. And they put him into jail, and then they tried to observe to see whether or not he was competent to stand trial because he seemed to be mentally unstable. He did have trouble with substance abuse, but he also had some delusions and hallucinations that we weren't sure what to do with. He was very much paranoid and concerned about conspiracies. So here's a really interesting controversy, and I'm not sure what I think of it, but there are times when there's a gap of time between the moment when a crime happens and when the judge and jury get together and actually make some decisions. And it's during that time that they have to decide if the person is competent. So at first, the forensic psychologist and the judge thought, he's not competent. He doesn't know what's going on. He can't stand trial. He just needs treatment somewhere in a mental health facility. And then they decided, against his will, that they would give him medication to try to make his mind stable. So here's a big question, and this is not agreed upon by all the people in America who are involved in these cases. Can you force somebody to take medication to make them mentally stable? To force them to be competent? When you're behind bars, the answer in many places is yes, you can force it on them. Which is interesting, isn't it? So in his case, he was forced to take medication to try to make his brain work a little better, and then he was considered competent to stand trial, and he did. And at that point, he understood what was going on. He passed all the tests that says, yes, I know what a judge is and a jury is, and I know what sentencing means. And what happened is he made a plea. He said, I will say that I am guilty, but then do not give me the death penalty. And that was the deal he made. So he's in jail for 1,000 years, and the other prisoners don't like him very much, but he is there. Third case. This one doesn't involve murder so much as it does rape. This is a very sad story in Ohio, and this is more of a private crime as opposed to the other two were very public crimes. In this case, a man named Ariel Castro used to have a wife and children, daughters, and then they left him at a certain point, but the neighbors knew him as a father of daughters, and so he knew a lot of young girls in the community because they were friends of his daughters. And one after another, he kidnapped 3 girls, one of them for 11 years, and the others for a little less than that. But he tied these girls up in the basement, continued to rape them, and starve them, and beat them. So it's not a crime of one moment. It's a crime that repeated itself every day for 11 years, and he had a veil of secrecy about it, of course. He never let anybody else who came to visit him go down to the basement where the girls were. So in his case, he was caught because one of the girls escaped. And one of them said, this is what's going on in our lives. The police came, they found out, and he was caught. He immediately said, I'm mentally unstable, I have a mental disorder, I didn't know what I was doing. So, he's claiming he's not guilty. Forensic psychologists, of course, are trying to figure out, is he competent to stand trial? So I actually have a videotape that I show my students of the day of the case when it came before the judge to just decide if he's competent. So they had 2 separate forensic psychologists spend many hours with this man to figure out, does he know what he's doing? Does he remember what he did? Does he understand the legal system? That's really basically what we have to find out. And they both separate psychologists said, he is competent enough to stand trial. He has to face the trial. So even though he felt that he was too sick to understand what he did, the forensic psychologist said, no, he is competent. So he faced his trial, and he was sentenced to 1,000 years as well. Now, of course, 1,000 years is just sort of an exaggeration, but they count up all the different moments when a person did a crime, in this case, many rapes and many years. And soon after he went to prison, he committed suicide. And so he had some indication that he was regretful and remorseful for what he did, but we're not exactly sure what was going on in his mind. So let's talk about the brain a little bit now. One of my favorite structures of the brain is called the anterior cingulate cortex. I'll show you a picture of the brain in just a second. But it's a place in the brain that is kind of like it combines information about what you do, which is managed up here, with information about what you feel, which is at the lower part, and what you think, which is at the front. These different lobes or sections of the brain all kind of come together. And it's fascinating to think how we think about, what do I love, what do I think, and what am I going to do, whether it's good things or evil things. And I'm fascinated with when the anterior cingulate cortex is not functioning very well, it's not unusual that that person has committed crimes. So is there a cause and effect? Which came first? Not sure yet. But again, the prefrontal cortex, which is in the front, is an area that manages us in a way that we are, I like to think of reins on a horse, a wild horse, and it helps us to control our impulses. So even if we fantasize about doing something, if the prefrontal cortex is working, it keeps us in check. That's how we self-regulate. Another area is called the fusiform gyrus, and it's right over here in the brain, and here. And this is what when it's working well, you look at another person's face and you can read how they feel. So imagine a criminal, let's say that last one, Mr. Castro, he's looking at the women that he's got in his basement. And for some reason, he is not registering that they are in pain and they are captured. It just doesn't work. So my guess is that his fusiform gyrus is not working very well. He has no empathy, doesn't seem to be able to understand and read people's expressions. Normally, we can. The amygdala is a part of the brain that is almost like a fire alarm. It gets very agitated, very excited when we think there's danger. And so when the amygdala is working well, we know that if we're in trouble, we run or we fight back. But with people who have antisocial personality disorder, which is a form of a disorder that's more specific than saying somebody is criminally insane, it means that they don't really seem to notice that this is a dangerous moment. So if they see somebody with blood, or if they've just shot up a whole movie theater, their amygdala doesn't go fire up and say this is a problem. They just look at it as neutrally as an empty theater. The emotions are not there. Now there's a new area of study called in the area of genetics. And there's a really famous psychologist, a neuroscientist named Jim Fallon, who you might want to look up. He does a TED Talk on this. And he has the assertion that there's a genetic marker called MAOA that seems to be inherited, and it provides the potential that somebody might become a psychopath or antisocial personality disorder. But it seems that you can inherit that tendency, but it won't actually happen unless you have a traumatic childhood, a lot of abuse. So you have nature and nurture working together. So just because you inherit it doesn't mean you're definitely going to be a criminal, but it's almost like you're predisposed. What seems to happen is that you might have less empathy for others. And so that there might be less remorse. So as long as that person is well cared for as a child, they're not as likely to become a criminal. But that's a whole new area of science. We have known for a long time that there's a part of the brain called the reward center, or more specifically, things like the nucleus accumbens. And this is where neurotransmitters fire when we feel wonderful joy. And so that's really on fire when you're under the influence of cocaine. And you don't care about anything else. So a small amount of rewards is great, but an intense amount actually ruins that part of the brain. So there's a lot of research on what can we do when people are high on drugs and are being responsible for their actions. Big controversy area. I mentioned earlier about stem cells. So here we have the brain, and although I'm not able to reach up there to point, I did mention the amygdala, nucleus accumbens. I didn't mention the insula, which is right below the anterior cingulate cortex. That's up there near the top. And it's sort of in the middle of the brain. It's a whole other area that we could talk about. Over on the side there, I have TPJ. That stands for the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, where they meet, the junction, right about here. And it's a fascinating part of the brain that helps me have a perspective of what do you think of me? What does my mother think of me? What do my friends think of me? It's a theory of your mind, and do I understand it? And if this area is not working well, it's very common that somebody is a criminal. Again, which caused what? Was there a brain trauma? That's a big question right now. But we're looking at all these different areas of the brain to try to figure out how do all of these structures function, or if there's dysfunction, what's going on. From a very different perspective, I'm fascinated with the social influences on criminals. You may have heard of the whole area of restorative justice. And I find it very harmonious with what Swedenborg says about the importance of looking at people face to face, because that's what angels do to us when we die. They look right in our faces. And with restorative justice, there's a whole program in the criminal justice system where you get either victims of the actual crime, or if that person died, such as with a murder, then family members, or people who had similar crimes but they survived, and they sit down face to face with the criminal. And they're surrounded by psychologists and people who run the prison, and it's a time for them to talk to each other and try to gain perspective. Very challenging to try to set that up, but it actually seems to help restore a little bit of the conscience. Because it's very common, at least when I was working in a prison, the guys wouldn't hardly ever talk about the crimes that they did, or they might elaborate on them, or they'd just say, she had it coming. It wasn't my fault. And so this restorative justice is trying to get people to feel a little more responsible for their action, even if it's years after the crime happened. So that's a very interesting area. I think there's a lot more hope there than there is with Scared Straight. Also, when I was in the prison, I was fascinated. Just down the hall from where I was teaching psychology, Quakers were invited in to teach alternatives to violence. They would teach verbal skills, assertiveness skills, I statements, mediation skills. And they just really had some wonderful progress in terms of helping people strengthen their interpersonal ability to tell people how they feel. Problem-solving skills. Conflict resolution that doesn't involve retaliation. Very interesting new areas. Another area that might be hard for people to have any empathy for, and that is, believe it or not, some criminals do it because they are socially anxious. Now, are they making that up? I don't know. But some just do not know how to handle social situations. They don't have the smooth social graces that everybody else has. There's a theory that maybe the people who were the young men at Columbine, the high school where they shot up others, they clearly did not seem to have the social graces to be able to understand how to handle their own social feelings of rejection. So if we could catch that early, help the little children who are feeling rejected by their peers, help them learn how to be good friends and get over their social anxiety, that would be a wonderful thing. Whole new area of research. I mentioned the mediation, but I'd like to highlight it again because I've seen research both in Baltimore, which is a high crime-ridden area, also in East London, which has got a lot of crime happening, especially led by gangs. And so if you could look at the same social patterns and try to get people who are brave enough to go in there and learn how to mediate, wonderful things can happen. I'm a big advocate of the 12-step program for people who are willing to try to be honest and make amends. It has to be sincere. And there are different ones for people who have narcotic issues as opposed to alcohol or other drugs. It's a long, slow, one day at a time process, but it's one part of the solution. Another one that's very interesting, and I just heard that on 60 Minutes recently, that there was a focus on prisons in Germany. Now, my recollection of 60 years ago is that German prisons were pretty awful. And most of us might remember those if we lived that long. But now there seems to be a whole new movement, and it's led by psychologists, to try to figure out, okay, if people are going to come out of jail, and in their country they don't have capital punishment now, if people are going to come out of jail, what kind of people do we want them to be? So how can we help them readjust to society? So they have a lot of success trying to help people readjust to society. And in my small town of Scranton, Pennsylvania, where I'm going to be spending a lot of my retirement time, I'm going to be doing the same thing, helping particularly women coming out, trying to be a mediator and a mentor, especially when they're trying to make deals with their family. Where should they live? Are they accepted back in the family? Can they get a job? So trying during that transition, a very important area. Okay, so coming to some summaries here. Forensic psychologists are not like what you see on TV. They don't get to chase the bad guys. They come in after a criminal has been apprehended or caught. And sometimes we have all the evidence in the world that they did the crime, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes there's speculation, and we have some evidence, but we're not quite sure if this person did the crime. It's their job to be expert witnesses, trying to understand the mind, and they call that mens rea. They also are trying to figure out motives. Was there any premeditation? Is there any remorse? Are they competent to stand trial? And they are also given the very difficult responsibility to diagnose somebody. Now, in the world of psychology, we actually don't use the word insane very much. We definitely try not to use the word crazy or madness. Those are common terms. We prefer to diagnose with very specific things going on, just like a medical doctor would try to diagnose the difference between the flu and cancer. You know, there's very different patterns. That's what psychologists do. So the forensic psychologists that I've interacted with, we are very careful about diagnosing antisocial personality disorder. The expert that I'm aware of is named Dr. Hare, H-A-R-E, and he's written some fascinating books. He's actually come up with a checklist to look at. Things like, does the person have any remorse? Do they seem to be very charming and very glib about what they've done? Do they manipulate other people? That kind of thing. So this is the job of the forensic psychologist, and then they're brought to the witness stand where they send in their report to the judges and the juries. And they're the ones who are the triers of fact. They are the ones who make decisions at a civil level. They also might be involved in diagnosing the extent of an addiction and whether or not the addiction had anything to do with the crime. So back to that case that happened down in Arizona when Gabby Gifford was hurt. Although the person, Jared Laughlin, he committed the crime, he had a history of substance abuse, but we don't have any evidence that had anything to do with the moment when he actually shot her. So it's not always a related thing that somebody has an issue with substance abuse. And another area that at the civil and moral level, as opposed to a spiritual level, is this fascinating area called malingering. This is when people fake something. They might fake being mentally retarded. They might fake being remorseful. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm in a man. They might fake that they have amnesia. They don't remember what was going on. They might fake that they were traumatized as children, and that's why they did it. These are very difficult things to sort out. And no forensic psychologist really can say that they are sure they know exactly when somebody's lying or not. All the area of truth-telling, it's not an exact science. So polygraphs, not an exact science. Giving somebody some kind of a medication to make them tell the truth, not a reliable source. So this is a very, very tricky area that's been tried for years by the CIA as well as by the judicial system. Another one is the term recidivism. That has to do with people who commit crimes, and they're allowed out of jail after a certain amount of time, but then what do? Very often they commit a crime again and they come right back in. So try and figure out psychologically, why would somebody want to go back to jail? Trying to figure that out and how do we reduce that is a fascinating area. So I like to look at civil, moral, and spiritual. And Swedenborg's writings tell us that we are supposed to make civil and moral decisions about our neighbor. And we should do it with a very fair system of psychologists and the judicial system, such as the judge and the jury. But Swedenborg says nobody should spiritually judge anybody. Nobody. So when I'm looking at those cases, for instance, I'm trying very hard not to spiritually judge and say, I know that they are evil. It's not my business to do that. I believe in an afterlife. I believe that that's where these things will happen. So in conclusion, as an individual, I'm a Swedenborgian psychologist who tries to bring that perspective in when I am interacting with people who have had troubles with the law. I try to understand from their behavior and from what I read from neuroscience, what's going on in their brain and can it be fixed? And I encourage anybody who's interested in this field, and I have students right now in my class who I hope in the future will do great things in the field of forensic psychology, and maybe some of you will be inspired, or maybe you'll download my book and decide you want to go into this area. Look for ways to prevent, look for ways to intervene, and look for ways to rehabilitate people. So thank you very much. I appreciate you coming.